Hi everyone! So this is the final lecture of the transnational online lecture series on digital feminism. My name is Pinar tuzcu. I'm a PhD candidate and a lecturer in the Sociology of Diversity department at the University of Kassel in Germany. And in this lecture, I will talk about a few issues concerning the changing politics of difference in cyberspace. I will look at the beginnings of what came to be known as cyberfeminism and then refer to a fairly recent example on Twitter, namely the SolidarityIsForWhiteWomen hashtag, to discuss the needs and potentials of feminism to go beyond gender. This means more generally, I am going to look at the kinds of positional entanglements existing or emerging in the digital age. By position entanglement, I mean the messy dynamics produced in the process of constructing one's political standpoint, because there is always an interference of and mediation through other positions from where one wants to speak or from where one is supposed to speak. This position entanglement acquires new dimensions in the digital era, since digitization is the new production of new spatial and temporal ambiguities. On the one hand, it produces new forms of delocalization, a delocalization of representation and embodiment. And on the other hand, there is also a temporal dimension, because there is a new Ungleichzeitigkeit, a non-synchronicity to digital space. In other words, digitization means that the space-times of representation and embodiment are radically multiplied and proliferated and messily reentangled. This is of course not an absolute novelty, since media have always been involved in forms of space-time compression, to use David Harraway's term. The point is, however, that with the internet, this space-time compression is hyper-accelerated and amplified. This results in a complex positional play. Because of the different modes of embodiment and disembodiment enabled in digital space, it isn't immediately clear who speaks from which position. But at the same time, it's important to point out that identities might not be as fluid and flexible as we always think they are in online settings, because one speaking also tends to stabilize one's identity. All what is said is immediately archived and therefore traceable, which means that one's position becomes sticky. They become identity tags which are very difficult, if not impossible, to undo. And they are also carried into the offline world, whereas this process does not necessarily exist in reverse. That is to say, we can more easily escape from offline position online. I'm saying all this because it is in this paradoxical setting that we need to rethink feminist politics of location and difference. So with this in mind then, my central question is, how do other differences beyond gender interfere with, limit or expand feminist politics in cyberspace? Before I'm going to say something on the emergence of cyberfeminism and what it means as a political concept or strategy, it's important to note that the term cyberfeminism is not widely in use anymore. Cyberfeminism was a term of the avant-garde at the time it emerged, while nowadays, with the ongoing integration of digital into non-digital life, it doesn't seem to capture even too narrowly described feminist activities today. Can we, for instance, call a feminist activist who uses Twitter a cyberfeminist? But nevertheless, it is important to look at how this term emerged in order to understand what we mean when we talk about today's digital feminism. In its rhetoric, cyberfeminism got its major inspiration from Donna Harraway's Cyborg Manifesto, published in 1986. And in this Cyborg Manifesto, Harraway described the cyborg as a form of existence that transgresses the boundaries between animal, human, and machine. Crucial to note is that Harraway did not only call for a feminist intervention in cyberspace, but her manifesto is to be read as a critique of an intervention in an anthropocentric, universalist, women-only tradition of feminism. Perhaps we can say that Harraway's cyborg is an assemblage of multiple feminist struggles: Chicana, Latina, Mestiza, Black, Brown, Queer, Migrant, and. However, the term cyberfeminism, as it established itself in the early 90s, was first and foremost seen as an intervention into ideas of technology, and particularly the computer and the internet, as male domains. The first widely known cyberfeminist groups were the Austria-based Manifesto Matrix, founded in 1991, and the All Boys Network, which was founded in Berlin in 1997. 6 years after publishing their cyberfeminist manifesto for the 21st century, Manifesto Matrix disbanded in 1997. In that year, All Boys Network organized the very first international cyberfeminist conference, which was held here in Kassel. A point about this conference I would like to discuss is that they did not define what cyberfeminism is, but rather they wrote 100 antitheses to declare what cyberfeminism is not. And many of the statements in this declaration are playfully ironic, such as cyberfeminism is not a fragrance, cyberfeminism is keine Theorie, cyberfeminism is not Lacanian, cyberfeminism is not about boring toys for boring boys. I want to draw attention especially to the final statement. Cyberfeminism has not only one language. In other words, cyberfeminism is not a monolingual project, or it means it doesn't belong to just one particular cultural location. Thereby, they seem to aim at diversifying feminism, attempting to challenge the tendencies of universalism and the ignorance of cultural, racial, and social difference in the dominant tradition of Western feminist rhetoric. However, interestingly, the languages used in this declaration are all European and colonial languages. In other words, one might wonder how come that at a time when postcolonial critique was already establishing itself as a practice of questioning European ethnocentricities and universalism, which Christina lucidly explained in the first lecture, how come that they didn't include other non-European languages? By asking this question, I don't mean to suggest including other languages for the sake of political or as a performance, political correctness, or as a performance of a kind of cosmetic diversity. What I'm trying to say is this: inserting other languages would mean an acknowledgement of other feminisms that do not directly or exclusively emerge from a Western context. I'm saying this because the conference took place in Germany, and most of its organizers were from Germany. While being concerned with the global, they seem to have overlooked the local. Aspiring a cosmopolitan sense of diversity, they missed the locationally specific transcultural dynamics occurring in Germany. Germany has a very peculiar history of authorizing practices with various intensities, with its colonial past, the Nazi regime and post-war migration experiences, and the internal East-West division. In other words, the inclusion of languages like Russian, Arabic, Turkish, Kurdish, Hebrew, among others, would perhaps more clearly reflect this transculturality rather than languages like English, Dutch, Spanish, and French. Again, this would not just mean the acknowledgement of other cultures, but also of other feminisms. Because especially at that time in Germany, in the 90s, and in fact in the late 80s, Afro-German, Jewish German, and queer migrant feminist groups were very active with critique of prevailing ethnocentricities in feminisms in Germany. Together with some German feminists in that period, these groups were engaged in questions of how to push feminism in Germany beyond gender. Mostly drawing on their own experiences, they were pointing out that exclusions are never only happening through gender, because gendering practices are always intertwined with other dimensions. For instance, exploitation and discrimination in the job market do not just operate through gender, but they have other prominent dimensions such as ethnicity, religion, ability, and political disposition. And strikingly, in feminist narratives and histories, the 90s in terms of feminist politics are often portrayed as a quieter moment, or even as a moment of silence of feminism in Germany. My point here is that while the All Boys Network Declaration made gestures towards a feminism without borders, it nevertheless reflects a particular historical silencing occurring in Germany, especially in the period when cyberfeminism was emerging. In this sense, cyberfeminist declaration perhaps assumed a too utopian attitude towards the digital, forgetting that it is not borderless by nature. As But as Rosie Brody puts it, the digital is just the social by another name. This shows that despite its various effects of delocalization, our digital era still needs politics of location. To make this more clear, I will now talk about a recent event on Twitter, which in my view displays this positional complexity very vividly. So what happened in August 2013 is that a male professor in gender studies who was known as a blogger for popular feminist online magazines made a rather controversial confession on Twitter, basically apologizing for his unfair, even abusive treatment of women of color who attended his classes or who were working together with him. In reaction to this, voices emerged that called for greater explanations, demanding apologies, especially from the institutions that enable this kind of mistreatment and abuse of women of color. Furthermore, they did not only want explanations for why this professor's abusive behavior and objectifying attitude towards some women of color was tolerated for so long, but also the problem was that their struggle against him has not been supported or just ignored by those who call themselves feminists. And when these larger explanations and apologies failed to come forth, frustration, disappointment, and anger were channeled into the creation of the SolidarityIsForWhiteWomen hashtag. This hashtag was created by Nikki Kendall, a US black feminist, and went viral within a couple of hours. In fact, according to the Twitter trend report platform itrended.com, for about 40 minutes, it was the third most popular hashtag around the world, used by about 7 million people. What's important here is to emphasize the fact that the major grievances articulated through this hashtag were not about the male blogger and his strange apology, but rather about ongoing unequal power relations within feminist movements and prevailing practices of white-only representation of contemporary feminism. Well, because this guy was working in feminist networks and declaring himself as a feminist. So the question then was, who has the right to speak as a feminist? And who has the power to provide access to certain platforms and give voices to some while ignoring others? Just to give another example. This image appeared in the New York Times in April 2012 for an article entitled "The New Shades of Feminism," which triggered a debate on what is represented under the name of the supposedly new feminism. This debate revolved around the questions of whether these women portray feminists as all white, all middle class. When all these points are taken into account, it becomes clear that the SolidarityIsForWhiteWomen hashtag was not a simple outcry against a particular individual, but it served for a profound critique of the institutional backdrop and the perpetuation of privileging practices. This also explains why it gathered a wide variety of voices around the globe. Not only black feminists participated in this hashtag, but also queer, Latina, Muslim, Asian, Arab, and many others. So what does all this tell us about feminisms in the digital age? How is this implicitly silencing text of the Old Boys Network Declaration linked to the SolidarityIsForWhiteWomen hashtag? And more generally, what is the relation between the politics of location in a time when we are talking about nomadic aesthetics of belonging and transnational forms of feminist activism? And I think Rosie Brody gives us an entry point to these questions. She writes, "One of the great contradictions of virtual reality images is that they titillate our imagination, promising the marvels and wonders of a gender-free world, while it simultaneously reproduces some of the most banal, flat images of gender identity, but also class and race relations that you can think of. This means we need to focus on contradictions produced in digital space. That is how these paradoxes, on the one hand a utopian promise and on the other hand a sense of backlash in terms of representation, call for new strategies of analysis and activism. This is why, as Maria and Kiri have so brilliantly pointed out in their lectures, feminist positionalities turn out to be awkward. This means there is a need to embrace failure and anticipate, even already embody, contradictory interpretations in the very performance of activism. In the SolidarityIsForWhiteWomen hashtag, we see how exclusionary practices we know from the offline world continue to exist online, despite or even because of the fact that the internet is often seen as the great equalizer, as if it magically eliminates all differences and inequalities. In fact, perhaps this hashtag reveals that, in a digital setting, it is too easily taken for granted that we are already beyond difference, and that therefore sisterhood as a universal, all-uniting paradigm can be unproblematically reclaimed. Or one of the participants of the cyberfeminist conference, Maria Fernandez, remarked, "Some cyberfeminists believe that it is useless to talk about differences because they can never be resolved. Whether it is because differences are seen as being of minor importance in digital space or as just too messy to be dealt with, it is anyways surprising that, after several decades of sustained intervention within the politics of representation, the new word of cyberspace should so faithfully mimic the old. It feels like something of a tired cliché to repeat." However, we can see how digital space has the power to immediately mobilize actors for resistance against injustice and exclusionary practices. And this tells something more general about the changing forms of feminist activism, since what we think of as a demonstration in offline setting is delocalized and translocalized, becoming spatially and temporally dispersed. And in her lecture, Hester provided fascinating examples of digital feminist activism that productively exploit this. On the other hand, activism performed online has great potential for endurance because, for instance, any hashtag can be reused. The lasting traces of protest in digital space can be easily reactivated and expanded. And indeed, it has been now more than a year since its creation, and the SolidarityIsForWhiteWomen hashtag is still in use. And this, I would say, also urges us to rethink the changing temporalities of activist culture. Nevertheless, it's important to note that the hashtag itself was also subject to critique from its own supporters. This is because the statement in the hashtag seems to insist on a strict divide between either black or white. Thus, many feminists who positioned themselves between, beyond, or outside this binary problematized the issue. As one of the hashtag users, a US Latina feminist, says on a blog, the hashtag doesn't seem to include her as a white woman of color. She starts off by saying, "The SolidarityIsForWhiteWomen tsunami forced me to wonder which side of the hashtag I should come down on, as a white woman or a woman of color." And as she goes on, "My racial makeup and identity is as contradictory as physical distinctions and cultural notions that make up the concept of race. It's both black and white." And she concludes, "I do, however, hope that the SolidarityIsForWhiteWomen hashtag involves in a more nuanced conversation that takes into account the various spectrums of race and ethnicity within gender justice, instead of lumping feminists into white and black." In other words, while participating in the hashtag's greater cause, so to speak, these voices of critique drew attention to the ongoing complexity of the politics of difference. However, one could also argue that the hashtag's insistence on a radical difference between black and white was performative to begin with. It could be seen as a strategic gesture in order to trigger immediate responses, and indeed it was very successful in doing this. That there is such necessity for this kind of performative binarization perhaps just shows that, whether off or online, there are discursive gaps and traps, an absence in language that makes it difficult to articulate a politic able to mobilize participation without going back to binary straitjackets. In fact, I would go so far to say that, together with the systemic critique it has mobilized, one major impact this hashtag has made is drawing attention to this discursive absence. When we look at the very beginning of how cyberfeminism emerged as a political concept, we notice that its beginning is not unproblematic. Both the Old Boys Network's 1997 declaration and the SolidarityIsForWhiteWomen hashtag have shown the ongoing need for feminist politics of location in the digital age, where location itself becomes a very slippery concept. If we are talking about feminism in a digital age, we need to make sure that we are talking about a delocalized yet locationally specific form of feminist activism. And rethinking location and difference entails rethinking solidarity. This means when we talk about feminism without borders, we shouldn't take for granted that virtual space is by nature its ideal domain. But rather we should see that with the transition into virtual space, we still need to challenge borders, only differently so. The point is that in virtual space, border politics and their attached forms of solidarity are still in place, though they need to be rethought and reshaped. Chandra Mohanty's understanding of solidarity is useful here, as she says, rather than assuming an enforced commonality of oppression, the practice of solidarity foregrounds communities of people who have chosen to work and find together. Diversity and difference are central values here to be acknowledged and respected, not erased in the building of alliances. To forge this kind of solidarity, there is a need for acknowledgement that the feminisms of our presences and futures are most productive when they engage in a playful and perhaps even joyful creation of alliances that exceeds pre-existing forms of affiliation, exhausted normativities, and banal solidarities. As Rosie Broidodi writes, nowadays women have to undertake the dance through cyberspace, if only to make sure that the joysticks of the cyberspace cowboys will not reproduce univocal felicity under the mask of multiplicity, and also to make sure that the riot girls in their anger and their visionary passion will not recreate law and order under the cover of a triumphant feminine. To do this dance through the paradoxes, ambiguities, and contradictions the digital era brings forth, we need to sing ourselves to the new rhythms that might pull alliances into the world. This would also mean being comfortable in the awkward delay and deferral and endless re-entanglement of the final question of what feminism is and for whom it speaks, and going on asking which differences matter here.